This series began as a side conversation while we were building a SoMeDocs documentary. Then, the side conversation got too interesting. Healthcare social media has its own rules, rewards, risks, and very confident comment sections. So we decided it deserved its own spotlight. Welcome to the Physician Feed. Do you think that humor belongs in healthcare? When Dr. Jordan Emond, board-certified OB-GYN, hopped into our virtual recording room to take part in our docuseries, conversation took a turn, and we ended up building an episode for the Physician Feed.
I absolutely think that humor belongs in healthcare. I think that humor belongs in everything that we do. I think that there is a right and wrong way to do this. For example, I think that this year we really saw how toxic it can become when medical professionals are using humor directed towards patients, and I think that that is never appropriate.
Stay tuned as we ask him exactly what he means and he shares the example.
I think that we particularly are in this era where people already have a significant mistrust of the healthcare system, doctors in particular. And I think that we have a very important responsibility to treat that relationship with the utmost respect without incorporating any kind of poking fun or humor directed towards patients. But I do think that we can incorporate humor into our individual relationships with patients, in terms of, creating a strong bond. I think we can incorporate humor into the content that we cover, particularly as that is directed towards the problems that exist in the healthcare system overall. And I think we can use humor with each other because I think that humor is just an inherent way that humans can connect with one another, and we should be trying to make healthcare more humanistic and not less so.
Is there something specific we need to call attention to?
I think that the example that I'm referring to in particular was the example of the medical student at Mayo Clinic, who I thankfully have forgotten his name at this point.
It's important that you see the footage in question for yourself. This video not only made headlines, but was the source of many conversations behind closed doors surrounding professionalism.
Rigorous? Labia majora? Damn, girl, how many pussies you got?
Who was posting for years, really, a number of videos that were in particular poking fun at, I would say, the state of women's experience with the healthcare system. And there were just some absolutely horrific videos that were making fun of female anatomy, were making fun of common women's health presentations to a clinical setting. And I think particularly being a man as an OBGYN, I'm just so ultra sensitive to how toxic that is because there is this long history of misogyny in medicine, particularly as it relates to the practice of gynecology. And I think that men in particular who are taking care of women, which I would argue is every single man in medicine, need to be conscious of how the misuse of that power can lead to a mistrust of not just all men in the field of medicine, but really all medical professionals. And this is really the perfect example of how humor can go horrifically wrong, that we should never be using humor that in any way deprecates the experience of a patient when they go see their doctor or deprecates the experience of having a certain medical condition that in general, and at least in the field of gynecology, are often sensitive topics that people don't want to talk about anyways. So that was particularly the example that came up. There was another video that was pertaining to a male nurse who, again, was using humor directed towards women's anatomy or female anatomy. And I think that we really need to be actively pushing back on removing these people from our healthcare experience. Now, I am not the type of person who is a very big believer in cancel culture. I think that maybe I'm a little bit too much of an optimist, but I do think that people can change. I do think that people can be corrected. And I don't necessarily think that we need to be saying that somebody should be completely removed from all professional experiences forever. In fact, I think that in a lot of ways that can actually build more bitterness in that person and in that group of people. But I do think that we need to be very actively saying this is a line. The line can never be crossed, and anybody who crosses it will face consequences. We exist in an era that allowed those transgressions to really be very publicized. And I actually think that this is a good thing because, like I said before, this misogyny has existed in medicine for the entire existence of the field of medicine. And I think that because we have this era of social media where people can be sharing things, people can be discussing things, we have this power now to really call out when these toxic figures and toxic experiences exist in our practice of medicine. And so I think it's a really positive thing, actually, that we can immediately call attention to these people who are doing really harmful things that affect all medical professionals, and we can create a movement out of it that really leads to real change.
We wanted to know here what disturbed him the most. Was it the content itself? Was it the public response encouraging it? Or was it the fact that these were current and future healthcare professionals?
I think that what bothered me the most was the content itself, of course, which I found to be disgusting for there's no other word to describe that. Um, I think that it is unfortunate that there was a lot of public interest in this figure, leading up to when his videos were identified to be so toxic. But I think that really just the existence of the content and maybe even I would argue the institutional acceptance of this, because this person who posted this, he had, I think, 400,000 followers by the time that this was identified. He was a fourth year medical student. I think that he was ultimately kicked out of Mayo Clinic School of Medicine a week before match day. This is somebody who made it very far. And I have no doubt that the leadership at his medical school knew exactly what was going on. And I actually wrote a Substack about this, that I think that part of the problem with toxic figures in medicine is that there's often a lot of institutional reticence to do anything about it because it's embarrassing for the institution and it's much easier to just sweep things under the rug. In the Substack that I wrote about this, I talked about a much more egregious figure who was actually at the institution where I trained, Columbia, named Robert Haddon, who is the person who is an OBGYN who has committed more sexual assault than anybody ever, because in his professional role as an OBGYN, he was committing sexual assault against his patients for more than a decade. Just absolutely the most horrific thing that I could imagine. And there is ample evidence that the institution knew about what was happening, knew about worsening issues over time. And even after he was ultimately arrested, they didn't do anything immediately to remove him from his position. In fact, he was back to work within 5 days of being arrested for a sexual assault that he committed in his active practice of medicine. So I think that this is another thing that is really disgusting to me, is that we really need to be holding institutions accountable for what they know, when they know it, and what they need to be held accountable for in terms of addressing the people that exist in their system. And I think that this example of Mayo Clinic and this medical student who clearly was building a social media following using humor directed towards patients, and again, particularly towards women, for years, and there was no consequences until it became a social media phenomenon. That is really awful. But I think that it does highlight the power of social media, is that it wasn't until this became a public incident that the institution was forced to do anything about it. And the same could be said for Columbia, that it wasn't until it became a news story that the institution really had to do anything about it. And honestly, I think that these institutions really have still not done enough.
We wanted to now know how much of this conversation was actually about professionalism versus empathy towards patients.
I think that it's both about professionalism and about empathy, because I think that those two things go hand in hand. I think that professionalism applies towards our colleagues as much as it applies towards patients. I think that we have a professional responsibility to act a certain way in regards to both of those environments. But I think that in particular here, I don't even know if empathy is the right word, because to me, empathy implies understanding what a patient is going through and really trying to identify the experiences that they're coming from, which of course is part of the discussion. But I think that it is even more fundamental than that, which is just basic human decency, that we should be treating others with the same respect that we would want to be treated with. And we would never want a situation where somebody was making fun of a medical problem that we have, particularly if that medical problem is something that is very sensitive for a lot of people to talk about, like something pertaining to their genitalia or their sexual function, or maybe their weight, which was another common theme in this figure's videos, or mental health disorders. So I just think that yes, it's both of those. It's professionalism and it's empathy, but it's also just to be a doctor is to be a human being, first and foremost, at least for me. And I think that we can never separate those two. I think that there's a lot of people that almost use the veil of professionalism as this separation between their work life and then who they are as a human, that you almost need to act a certain way or put on a certain mask when you walk into a clinical setting. But I see those two as hand in hand. And to some extent, it goes back to what we were talking about where is the role for humor in medicine. And that is, I think, where that human aspect comes into play. That, of course, part of your job as a doctor is to meet your patient where they're at, identify what drives them, what is interesting to them, what are the things that make them happy, make them sad, and how can you, as a human being who understands the emotions of another person, match that and create a relationship that is real, that's not just a part that you're playing. And so I think that this whole situation comes back to that what this person was posting, it was unprofessional, it was unempathetic, but at a most basic level, it was not human. It was undermining the humanity of the experiences of the people who are coming to see us to get help.
You've just listened to an episode of The Physician Feed. Thanks.